So I'll get started. Thank you for coming. This is the session that I call Why is Crawling So Important? It's an early learning session for early childhood educators and parents and of course teachers. So it'll take about half an hour, but of course if you have any questions we can go from there. So to give you an idea of why I'm so passionate about motor development here's some photos of my two little ones. I've got Hugh on the left, the little boy on the swing, and I've got Phoebe on the right, my little one trying to stand up. So when I have 5-year-old twins, and Hugh, when he was in utero, he was laying sideways across my tummy. So he didn't get that head movement and going upside down that most kids would get. So when he was born, he was quite delayed in his reflexes, and he was delayed when he was moving his head around. You could see his eyes get quite dizzy when he tried to move his head. And then Phoebes is 2 on Monday. When she was born, she had gestational diabetes. Well, I had gestational diabetes, so she had to get her feet pricked a lot to check for blood sugar, and now her feet are super sensitive. So I had to do a lot of work with wanting her to touch the ground. So when she was delayed with her standing and her walking, not for anything neurological, just the fact that she didn't like touching her feet on the ground. Where now, yeah, she's nearly 2 and she's full on. So we've definitely caught her up to speed. So just to give you some background of who I am, I'm an exercise physiologist and a developmental educator. So I have a master's in disability that advanced me to be a developmental educator. At the moment, I design specialised programs for kids with developmental delay, autism, dyslexia, ADHD, and children from a traumatic background. And then in the last few years, I've been really passionate about training and speaking, because I find that as a therapist, I can only really help one child at a time. But as a trainer, I can give this information to hundreds of people, and then that's obviously helping hundreds of children. So any questions, as I said before, feel free to stop me and we can go from there. So when we talk about W-sitting, which is sort of what got quite a bit of interest online, is it's this position that this little girl's in. So with her legs out behind her. Children typically around 18 months will sit in W-sitting. It's when they're getting their core strength right and when they're starting to realise how their body can move. The difficulty, though, is when that W-sitting progresses into preschool and primary school. If you look at why children typically W-sit, it can be because of poor core strength. So what they're doing is, instead of sitting on just a tiny little space of their bottom, they put their feet and legs out, so then it increases their base of support. So their core doesn't have to do as much. Their tummy muscles don't have to do as much to sit upright. Their legs and their bottom stabilize them. It's basically giving them a bigger base to sit on, so then their core doesn't have to do as much. The concern for that, though, is we want kids' core strength to be really good. We want them to be able to play sport. We want them to be able to run and jump. So sitting in this position can really hinder their core development. The thing that also obviously worries, which a lot of people speak about, is their hip position. So our hip is a ball and socket joint. So sorry, I can't bring my hands closer. So the femur sits inside the hip joint. And if you can imagine, when we're externally rotated like that, when the hips are rotated like that, it puts pressure on the joint. Short periods of time when they're sitting, so they're sitting in that position for 20 minutes, not a big deal. Kids are quite flexible. But if you look at that hip position long term, then we worry about that. Sorry, Karen, thanks for coming in. I've recorded it, so anything that you've missed, I'll send through to you to be able to see. So when we're looking at W-sitting, we're looking at core strength, so the ability of the tummy muscles to hold them in proper sitting position instead of relying on the legs being kicked out behind. And we're looking at hip position. So we want the hips to be protected from that, what we call external rotation, where the ball of the joint is sitting rotated inside the hip. My concern from a neurodevelopment point of view, not a muscle point of a bone point of view, is if we look at when we're in tummy time, if we spend a lot of time in tummy time first, we naturally progress from tummy time into what we call creeping and then crawling. But if we sit our babies up instantly into this static sitting position where they're sitting obviously cross-legged or they're sitting in this W sitting position, it's hard for them to then get into crawling. They've got to sort of be able to get that ability to kick their legs out and crawl. But if they were already in tummy time, that progression to creeping and crawling would happen naturally. A baby really isn't designed to be sitting in static position, but because of our lifestyle, we've got into this type of habit of sitting them upright. And then that leads to our neck movement. So when we're in tummy time and we're creeping and we're crawling and an educator or a parent calls their name, they tend to look up and follow you with their head. But when they're in this W sitting or static sitting position, they don't need to look up and move their head. They just look straight ahead. So when we're looking at W sitting, it's not just about the hips. I feel like chiros have got that amazing message out there, but we need to get out the message of core strength. We need to explain to people that a baby really needs to move their head up, down, left, right, and we'll chat about that a little bit more soon. So I'm just checking in again to make sure everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. And yes, the reason why I want to share this information is it's not well known to people like maternal health nurses. Yes, they understand that W sitting is bad for the hips, but maternal health nurses don't have that knowledge base of how important it is for children to move their head, and that's what we're trying to promote today, that children really need to move their head. And I'll explain why. Sorry about this slide here. I haven't edited it properly. We have when we're born, infantile reflexes. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, so I'll just explain it for you both. So infantile reflexes are when a baby is coming through the birth canal, right at the time of birth, that we have a reflex where the head will come down, and obviously as it comes out of the birth canal, when the head turns, the shoulder will turn as well. That is great for birth because poor mum doesn't want to get two shoulders coming through a natural delivery. So the brain is designed as the head comes down and the head turns, the whole shoulder turns to allow that safe delivery. That reflex should be gone in the first 12 months of life. It goes by the baby starting to move their head independent of their body. So when we're laying on our back, we're looking at the roof, we're moving our head. When we're in tummy time and our mums and dads are moving around, we're moving our head. The difficulty that we're getting these days is if we're getting put into that static sitting position, we don't tend to move our head up and down. And if worse for this is if we're given an iPad or an iPhone or some sort of electronics in front of us, then our head doesn't have to move. So when the child comes to 3 to 4 to 5 years of age, they haven't moved their head independent of their body. So we'll be sitting in circle time and we'll have everyone set up and we'll get, say, Johnny to look over to the whiteboard and his shoulder will move with his head because he still has that reflex. So we're looking at trying to raise awareness of all these things in early learning to give children the best possible start to their learning. Yeah, absolutely, Linda. So it is very common. We're finding at least 25% of preppies have trouble with these basic motor skills. I believe it's even more than that, but the evidence that we have is 25% of primary school children are not developmentally ready, and this is one of the areas that we're in. And it's just because it's not out there. I don't think any parent is or any family is knowing about this. It's not very well known of the importance of a child moving their head, and why it's so important to move our head is to get rid of this infantile reflex so we can move our head independent of our body. So a quick way to test this with kids is I get them on all hands and knees. This is my daughter here, Isla, and I get them to pretend that they're a cat, and then I ask them to slowly lift their head up and then slowly put their head back down. So I might get them to look up at the sky and then we look back down at the ground. It's a slow movement, and what I'm looking for is to see whether the hips buckle or the elbows buckle. They sort of will move. The head should be able to move freely up and down without the shoulders or the hips moving. If it's moving, then we can see that this child hasn't had enough development in that area of head movement. Things that we do is we might do lots of looking left, looking right. We'll do lots of games where we throw a ball across the room and they have to follow the ball and catch the ball. It's, for most children, you can catch it up within 6 weeks. Obviously, children with significant developmental delay, it can take longer, but it's quite a simple thing, and we're just missing it in that maternal health and early learning stage. And it's of no one's fault. It's just that the evidence hasn't got out there yet. The other one is similar to, you've got the symmetrical neck reflex and you've got the asymmetrical. So both do two different things, but both are for that safe delivery for mum and baby. And looking left and looking right is another way that we want to make sure that the head can move independently, so it can look left and it can look right, and without those elbows and those hips buckling or sort of shifting as the head moves. You can imagine if we have children who have difficulty in this area, when they go to move their head, their whole body will move, so they'll be considered quite fidgety. And of course, if they aren't able to control their body properly and their body's always wanting to move, then they'll typically be in that W sitting position because they just need to feel grounded. They don't really understand their own body yet. They're still stuck in that infant stage. The reason why we need to move our head, so it's not just about getting rid of that infantile reflex, even adults, everyone needs to move their head. We have a system in our inner ear called the vestibular system. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, but the vestibular system gives us our balance. It tells us that when I move my head, I need to keep myself upright. So if you look at the gentleman over here doing a nice stretch with his head down, his vestibular system is telling him that his head is upside down. So it will tell the hips and the feet to balance to keep him from falling forward and from falling over. When we live a lifestyle where everything is in front of us, even as we're sitting here now, our laptop or our phone is directly in front of us, we're not testing the vestibular system. The vestibular system is switched off when our head's not moving. If we don't have a strong vestibular system, then we have difficulties with balance. These kids become quite clumsy, they run into things, or they'll do the opposite where they will spin and rock and jump excessively to try and get that vestibular stimulation. So the things that I always try and do if children are my children play with electronics, they have an iPad, but I try and encourage them to do it tummy time while they're laying forward on their tummy. So even if they're on the iPad, I know that I can distract them every 10 to 15 minutes, and they have to look up and see where I am at. And then also if I'm having a conversation with them, they have to move their head a lot more than if they were just sitting with the iPad straight in front of them. Vestibular, the system is also important for giving them a feeling of knowing where they are when they're looking up at a whiteboard, and then when they're looking back down to their notes if they're taking notes. If our vestibular system and visual system aren't working together as a team, we'll look up at the whiteboard, we'll lose track of where we are, and then when we come back down, kids can actually feel quite dizzy. Some kids can even say that they feel yucky, they have butterflies, because that head movement can give them vertigo, which is what some adults get. So if you have any kids that say they feel nauseous, just check if it's when they move their head a lot, and it's just a recommendation to go to their doctor and mention that it may be their inner ear. The main thing that I always want to get across is crawling. I don't like to play a blame game of why a child didn't crawl enough. Did they not like tummy time? There's no point worrying about why this happened. What I want to look at is right now, can they crawl? And if they can't, we have to get them to crawl. And the reason why we need them to crawl is crawling involves both hemispheres of the brain at the same time. So this is little Phoebe's here last year. You can see that when her left hand goes forward, her right knee comes forward as well. And then when her right hand comes forward, her left knee comes forward. And it's using left and right hemisphere of the brain at the same time. The reason why we want that is it's a term called crossing the midline. I'll chat to you a bit more about it in a minute. It's not just the crossing the midline that's really important and using both sides of the brain at the same time. It's for core strength. So Phoebe in that position has to hold her tummy up against the ground. Creeping is okay. Creeping still gets a baby, or even army crawl still gets a baby to move around, but we need proper crawling position to test all of those elements, to use our core strength, to use both sides of our brain at the same time. And the best part about crawling is this visual tracking. So when she's crawling and she's looking around to see what else is around, her head's moving up, her head's moving down, left, right, that is what we need. We need that skill to be able to read off of a whiteboard. We need that skill to be able to read a book. If you imagine we look at a book and we want to be able to hold the book with our hands and read and track from left to right without our shoulders moving, without us losing our space on the page. And crawling is one exercise that is fantastic for reading and visual tracking. So you can pick up this skill at any age. I get teenage kids to crawl under tables. Typically in a primary school, I would love every child in primary school to know how to crawl, and it's quite concerning the number of kids that don't know how to crawl or have never crawled. And look, it's not a direct link to say people who haven't crawled have difficulty reading, but there is literature there to show that crawling, a lack of crawling, can impair reading ability. And it's to do with both sides of the brain working at the same time and being able to look from left to right. Lycra tunnels are amazing. I think they're fantastic, and they're fantastic for all ages. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that, Linda. Any sort of table or tunnel or outdoor space where they can crawl under is wonderful. Other things that we can get kids to do is we go on our hands and knees like a cat, and we just sort of give each other high fives from side to side. It doesn't need to be crawling across a room for too long. It's just getting them into that mode of we're doing both sides of our brain at the same time, and we're holding our tummy up off of the ground. Crawling races are wonderful. Crab crawling, if kids prefer that. So crab crawling is when we're on our back. We sort of have our tummy up towards the roof. All those types of crawling is wonderful for the brain. So crawl, 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 absolutely. It's great for us adults as well. Crossing the midline is the concept where we use both sides of the brain, and we actually go from using one side of the brain over to the left. So to give you an idea now, I'm mirrored, but my right hand is fueled by my left side of my brain. So my left side of my brain tells my right hand what to do. When I want to cross the midline and say take an object from the other side of my head, the message has to go across the middle of our brain, our corpus callosum, because our eyes then start to have to tell our body, oh, we've swapped over to the other side. And that is the information that's really important for crossing the midline. We need it for sport. We need it for driving a car. We need it for reading. Because if you imagine when we hold a page in front of us, our eyes have to cross the middle of the page over to the other side of the page in a nice smooth motion. What I typically get children to do is give them an A3 piece of paper, A4 if they're teeny tiny kids, but A3 piece of paper if you can. And I draw 2 lines on either side of the paper. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here, but there's 2 lines on each edge of the paper. And I get them to draw a rainbow 8 times from one side of the paper over to the other. And I tend to get them to use different colors because they love that. What I'm looking for isn't how beautiful their rainbow is. I'm looking for that nice, smooth arc from one side to the other. So my daughter did this last year. You can see it's pretty good. It's not too bad. What we're looking at, though, is the symmetry. So we want this side to be symmetrical to the other side. What we'll see some kids do is they'll have trouble getting to the edge of their page. So they might get halfway and then stop. Or they might draw a really tiny rainbow because that's in their center visual field. So they're having trouble still crossing the midline. They're sort of stuck in the middle. So we want really big movements. You might see also some children where they'll go over the top and then a straight line down. You can see that that's a definite difficulty with crossing the midline. This information is just for you to know we may need to do more crossing the midline activities. So we may need to, tap our opposite hand to our opposite knee. We can do things like drawing a rainbow in circle time as a sensory break. And the main thing is just alerting, once we can see that they're having difficulties with crossing the midline, alerting to parents, doctor, and then obviously they can get more intense help with that. Once we are aware of the things that we need to include in our day, head movement, crossing the midline, crawling, then we can catch up lots of kids at the same time. And these exercises are great even for kids who have already mastered crossing the midline. So I'm not sure what's happened here. I apologise. I think that's a video that's not working. So what I see each day from the delays that we're seeing in some children's development is they're coming into class with like an iPad type pencil grip. So I've got an upcoming handwriting webinar, so feel free to check that out. And this can be from our iPad use. It can also be from our reduced, we don't use our fine motor as much anymore now with electronics. So puzzle play and all those types of things are really important. We're seeing the crossing the midline issues where our rainbows are quite limited in our ability to go from one side of our body to the other. And then, of course, we're seeing our infantile reflex issues where looking up and looking left and looking right are quite challenging for kids, and their elbows and their hips are moving while their head should be the only thing that's moving. What I tend to tell all educators to do is check all kids. So play games where you pretend you're a cat and we observe different kids and how they move. Also check that if when kids move their head, if their body's moving as well, then you can start to see that they're having that sort of difficulty. I also tend to, when I set up play stations, if I want to challenge crossing the midline, I set up, say, a bucket of pegs on their left if they're right-handed, and I make them have to go across their body to pick up the peg, to go across to use the peg. Those sorts of things, you can start to see those children that are having lots of difficulties. And the best part about the brain for most children is the more we practice that skill, the better our brain becomes at it. So obviously children with developmental delay is a little bit different, but children who are just typically haven't practiced these skills before, they will progress really quick with just lots and lots of practice. So the things that I'll go over, this is the last slide for you to read, but the things that I'll go over again is we want to incorporate head movement every day, and we want to encourage tummy time, even if it's just laying tummy time to do a puzzle or laying on our tummy to write on a whiteboard. It doesn't have to be for long periods of time. 2 to 5 minutes at a time is better than nothing. And then we want to play lots and lots of crawling games. So the thing that I wanted to get out of most today was, obviously this is the first webinar that I've done using this new software, so thank you for your patience. And I wanted to get the message out there that children's development is really important to get hold of super young, so then we can get onto it before they hit primary school. And these are the things we really want to be looking out for. So I finished really quick. I think I might have spoke too fast. But we've got half an hour, so even if you wanted to ask any questions, if you wanted to share any scenarios that you've had, I'm more than happy to stay and have a chat. So please share any questions you might have. Thank you, Linda. Thanks very much. Even if you wanted to share typically what challenges you see some children are having, we could maybe brainstorm. Yes, Linda, absolutely. So stiff movement is a sign of developmental difficulties. So to basically, when we have 3 stages of learning a new skill. So we have the introductory stage, we have the progressive stage, and then we have the mastery stage. In the introductory stage of learning a new skill, the movement is very rigid and stiff. It has that look of being stiff, and they make lots of little errors. Once they get past the introductory stage of a movement, say they're learning how to pick up a pencil, once they get past that introductory stage and they get into progression, their movement starts to get a little bit smoother. They might be able to apply the same skill to different shaped objects. And then mastery is obviously when they can do it automatically. They can do it while they're talking to you. They can do it while they're distracted. But the stiff movement is a key sign that they're still in that introductory phase. So all it is it's lots and lots of repetition. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for your feedback. Yes, absolutely. Physical development it really needs to be talked about more. I feel that, I've worked in early learning for over 10 years now, and I feel like it's a lot of social and emotional and behavioural, which is very, very important. But I'm really passionate about getting at physical development as well, because if you can imagine these children that are feeling quite rigid all the time, they're quite exhausted. Just picking up a puzzle piece is exhausting for them if they've never done it. They're going to have those behavioural and social issues. So I'm not saying, it's a chicken or the egg. No one really knows what is the thing that's causing most of this issue for kids. But if we can look at all of these aspects together and make sure that their physical development is observed and assessed just as much as their social and emotional. Coming back to that stage where they look quite rigid, Linda, if you just have a look, make sure no children are having any tremor type movements. If they are, please let parents and their doctor know. When we are learning a new skill, we look stiff, but it doesn't have a tremor or a jump in it. Just to make sure we rule out all those types of things. But typically we are seeing quite stiff, rigid, nearly robotic type movements for some kids because they just haven't done it. They tend to be exposed to different types of toys and different types of play now than what our body's designed for. Yes, absolutely, Karen. Thank you for adding that. Yeah, so it's also having the creativity to know what the starting point is for a skill. So, for example, when I look at scissor use in early learning, it's not just giving a child a pair of scissors and going, okay, so away we go. It's breaking down to, do they have a preferred hand? Have they figured out which one their dominant hand is yet? If they haven't figured that out yet, we start with learning our dominant hand. Once we learn our dominant hand, we then start with our pinching action, because scissors is quite a pinching action. And it's breaking it down to those simple steps rather than just going, well, come on, keep practicing scissors. We need to go even back to, do they know what hand to use? Can they go down onto the table to pick up their own pair of scissors? Do they know how to do that? And do they have ability to pinch? Ah, fantastic, Linda. I've never heard of that. It'd be great to, is there a website link or anything? That looks really interesting. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, that'd be great, Linda. Thank you very much. That'd be wonderful. I'll just send you my Facebook page and feel free. That'd be great. There are wonderful resources out there. There's also, I feel like in early learning, we're becoming more creative. We want to try new things and do what's best for kids, and it's just getting this information to all of you so that you can then plan for, okay, tomorrow I want to work on scissor use, but I need pinching activities first, or tomorrow during circle time we're going to crawl or pretend we're a cat, and it's just changing up the lesson a little bit. Ah, fantastic. Thank you, Linda. That's wonderful. So, are there any other questions or anything else you'd like to know about? I'll be doing more webinars soon to talk more. There's not just those two reflexes. I'll be doing more to talk about the other reflexes. There's more involved in sensory integration and sensory play. Are there any other topics that you'd love to learn more about, or anything else that you'd like? Ah, fantastic, Linda. That would be great. Yeah, wonderful. Are there particular challenges that you're finding with kids? So obviously, Linda, you said before they're quite stiff. Are there any other skills that they're having trouble with that you'd like to know more information about? Any tasks that you are finding they're finding quite frustrating? Visual tracking, yeah, absolutely. Obviously, my main one is throwing a ball in various directions for visual tracking. We also do the drawing a rainbow is another wonderful one, whether it's chalk on outdoor play, whether it's another thing is with a spray bottle on a fence. If you just spray water on a fence and again make them follow their hand as they spray water on a fence. But I can definitely come up with some more ideas and put some pictures. I know it's easier when you have pictures for visual tracking. That's a great idea. Thank you. Well, I think that's all for today's webinar. Thank you so much for having me and for coming into and taking time out of your day. It was wonderful to answer some of your questions. And if you have any more questions, please contact me on Facebook or via email. And I look forward to our next one coming up tonight. Tonight we have a webinar about technology and how that's impacting our children. So I'll send the recording via email and you can keep it for a later time. So thank you for having me. Thanks for coming. Ta.